in any case, she says that the real beginning of U.S. military presence started immediately after started with the introduction of the U.S. military into World War II. So she says that in 1938, prior to U.S. entry, the U.S. had 14 military bases outside of the U.S., so it had a very, very minimal overall military footprint on the world. By 1945, after World War II was concluded, the U.S. had 30,000 military bases in 100 countries across the world. And then in 1948, she says that that number shrank to about 2,000 because in 1945 we had a 12 million man army. We substantially demobilized that army and massively withdrew a lot of our forces back into the U.S. So in 1945, where we had 30,000 bases, what constituted a base might have just been a collection of 3 or 4 buildings, or it might have been a camp, just literally an army camp that has tents that they set up and they just stay there for for a couple of months or even quasi-permanently. But after 1948, the U.S. started consolidating a lot of its military to particular allied countries. We negotiated security commitments with a lot of allies across the world. The most important of these are the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which I already stated, which is essentially 26 members of mostly Europe and then North America, like the U.S. and Canada. But otherwise Europe. The only member of the topic that's a member of NATO is Turkey. We also negotiated bilateral security commitments with Japan, and then later on during the Cold War with South Korea, and then a host of other countries like Australia and New Zealand and a lot of countries that aren't part of the topic. When we make a commitment to another country, such as NATO, we generally do 2 things. Number one is we establish a formal security guarantee. You should write down the word security guarantee because a lot of the literature and a lot of the evidence in your packet that you're going to get about the app that was written for the camp and so forth uses the term security guarantee loosely but doesn't actually define it, and you need to know what that means. A security guarantee is just a formal commitment to defend the allied country in question. So if the U.S. had 0 military resources in South Korea, the U.S. would still technically have a security guarantee with South Korea. So if North Korea attacked South Korea, the U.S. would still probably be drawn in. It's just easier for the U.S. to be drawn in if the U.S. actually has forces there. So it has a security guarantee, and it is probably not really a topical action to eliminate that security guarantee from any of these countries.
Are those only defensive actions?
Yes. As part of that security guarantee, we have something called a nuclear umbrella, which is basically just the same thing as a security guarantee, except it involves nuclear weapons. So if South Korea was attacked by North Korean nuclear weapons, the U.S. would launch nuclear weapons against North Korea, or at least that's the promise of the nuclear umbrella that exists in South Korea. The important defining feature of a security guarantee is it does not require actual forces to be in that particular country, and for the nuclear umbrella, we don't have nuclear weapons in any of the topic countries except for Turkey. So, there's a ton of literature about Japan and South Korea as it involves nuclear weapons and the nuclear umbrella and the security guarantee. That is all talking about our formal commitment to those countries. It is not talking about military presence to those countries. All right, then the second thing is just actual troops that are deployed as part of U.S. military presence. We send troops to bases within those countries, which is what happens when we negotiate a security guarantee. So I'm not aware of a country in the world that we have a security guarantee with that we don't also have some kind of actual military presence within that country. But theoretically, that security guarantee could exist without the existence of troops. It also, when we negotiate a formal security treaty with a country, it includes status of forces agreements and access rights to airspace in their seas. And you need to know the term status of forces agreement, which is just called SOFA for short. But it's a status of forces agreement. So if we station U.S. military personnel in a country, prior to us doing that, we have an actual agreement, with a legal agreement with that country that governs how those U.S. troops should function. It governs where they can go, it governs where the bases are. It essentially establishes those bases as U.S. soil. So our bases in Japan, if you commit a crime on a Japanese naval base, you will be tried in a U.S. court of law. If you walk off that base, you will be tried by a Japanese court. And the reason that division exists is because of the status of forces agreement. And that also includes like access rights to airspace in their seas. So for example, in 2003, the U.S. wanted to use Turkish airspace to help the operation to invade Iraq. We have a couple of Air Force bases in Turkey. Turkey would not allow us, as I said before, those bases are primarily logistical. Turkey would not allow us to use those assets to transport troops into Iraq, even though we had a status of forces agreement with them that included rights of airspace. But the Turkish parliament was like, hell no, we're not doing that because Iraq is, if not our friend, we don't want them destabilized. And the U.S. got very angry, and it caused like a huge relations dispute with them because the U.S. violated the Turkey violated the agreement that they had already agreed to with the United States. Kevin Lutz also says that bases have substantially declined since then. So when we had like 2,000 bases across the world, part of the reason we did that, the number one reason why bases have declined, and this is very important, is technological change. The U.S. is just a lot better than what it does now than what it did during the Cold War. At the beginning of the Cold War, to provide a shipment of arms from Florida to, to a country in the Middle East, I believe she said Egypt, but I didn't write that down. It required 12 stops of a ship. Like that ship had to actually stop at 12 different bases to refuel and resupply in order to get those arms there. Which meant we had 12 bases. To get from point A to B, we had to have those bases because otherwise we couldn't get what we needed to get from point A to B. Now, the U.S. military can do that with 0 stops. So they can do non-stop, so they don't need that many bases anymore. Because the U.S. military has something called global reach. We can send an aircraft, we can send a bomber from any point in the U.S., or actually a lot of our bombers are in Guam. We can send that anywhere in the world without the need for a base because there's something called aerial refueling, that we can refuel that bomber in the air if necessary. So, we have the crews that pilot the bomber can rotate on the bomber itself, and they can hit any target in the world. So the need for actual bases is substantially less than what it was during the Cold War, which is why I said one of the goals of presence is more political than military, that the U.S. can technically, operate from almost anywhere in the world. It still requires, for massive invasions like Iraq, for example, it still requires, shipments of large amounts of ground troops and so forth. But to conduct the major military operations that the U.S. Would conduct for what it expects for military threats in the future, we probably don't need that many